It was a simple message of non-confidence from the Conservatives, saying the House has no confidence in the Prime Minister and the government. But it didn't get very far. It needed the support of both the Bloc and the NDP in order to bring the government down, and it got neither.
I never support Liberals. Help me God. I support the interests of Quebecers, if those interests are also good for Canadians.
New Democrats came to Ottawa to get stuff done, to work for people, to fight for people, not to play Pierre Poilievre's Conservative games. So we will not be supporting Pierre Poilievre's motion.
Joining me now is our Inside Politics panel. We have the Globe and Mail's Robert Fife and Stephanie Levitz, both now at the Globe and Mail. Congrats, Steph. Great to see you both.
It's nice to be here.
It has been a wild political summer, and even busier fall. The great excitement by some and less than excitement by others around the possibility of a non-confidence motion, which will still happen next week in the House, but it's basically over before it started. Steph, your take on that?
I mean, over before it started for now. Pierre Poilievre had made it clear going through the summer that this was going to be the thing he was going to do right away. Right? He kept calling for a carbon tax election as soon as the NDP signaled that, their deal with the Liberals that had been propping up this minority government was officially over. Not that it ever wasn't over or wasn't, who knows. Pierre Poilievre said he was going to do this thing. And when Pierre Poilievre generally says he's going to do something, Pierre Poilievre goes ahead and does it. So it's not a surprise. I also don't think it's a surprise necessarily that the Bloc moved quick to say they wouldn't support it, because they've seen now, the Bloc Québécois, what the NDP managed to achieve by agreeing to prop up the Liberal minority government. So why shouldn't the Bloc Québécois, who really is just focused on Quebec, try and make the same play going forward?
Do you think, Mr. Poilievre had to know that going into this?
Yeah, but, I'm not sure that there is still a potential that we could have an election before Christmas. This is a prime minister who is bleeding out. He's almost the walking dead. And the opposition parties have to make a decision. If he, for some reason, decides to leave and there's a leadership convention, that could change the whole thing, the whole dynamic. So why not take him out now when he can't even win safe ridings in Montreal and Toronto? So I still think that's a possibility. Probably, though, it'll more likely be on the budget in the spring, but there is that possibility that could happen now. And also the Liberals have to be careful playing footsie with the Bloc Québécois. If you think they're in trouble now, they'll be in a lot worse trouble in English Canada if people start to see them playing footsie with the Bloc Québécois.
And not to mention in Quebec, where they just lost a supposedly safe seat that had been occupied, of course, by David Lametti, the former Justice Minister, to the Bloc. If the Bloc is seen as empowered, if I'm a Quebecer thinking about where to vote, well, the Bloc's proven their worth. And, we have another loss this week. Take a look, Pablo Rodriguez. We've got a little graphic here for our viewers. Pablo Rodriguez, if you're not familiar with him, cabinet minister who is stepping out to run for the provincial Liberal leadership. You can see that he easily won his riding in the last several elections. Long-time Liberal riding, only went NDP once. But he was not exactly emphatic in his support for the Prime Minister when he left. And in fact, he's sitting as an independent. Where do you see that, Steph? Is it just that he's interested in that Liberal leadership, or is it the continuing sign that Justin Trudeau is struggling to keep some of his top people?
Both things can be true at the exact same time, right? If you're a senior politician coming towards, let's say, the final arc of your career, like Mr. Rodriguez may in fact be, you have to look at the tea leaves and say, well, I could take a kick at the can at being the leader of something, or I might get stuck being an opposition shadow minister for Nothingsville. And really, do you want to do that? I don't think you do. And when Mr. Rodriguez, I know he's telling people he strongly believes he can win the Quebec Liberal leadership and maybe really put the fight to the people of Quebec in the next provincial election. That's obviously got to be more attractive for somebody than looking at the polling numbers. He may have held his seat in a federal general election, but he certainly wouldn't have held a front bench seat should Mr. Poilievre form government.
Bob, what does it say that he's choosing to sit as an independent, and the fact he's maintaining that seat at all? If you're his constituents, how could he possibly be representing you on Parliament Hill while he's running a secondary campaign? Is that purely Justin Trudeau saying you cannot leave right now and leave that seat empty?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great cartoon in one of the papers about Pablo leaving the sinking federal liberal ship to the sinking Quebec Liberal Party seat, and that's basically what's happening. But to claim that he's an independent when he's been a lifelong Liberal and just left the cabinet minister is a bit bizarre. I don't get it. But for sure, he's obviously said, I don't want to put you in a situation where you're going to lose another by-election. But I found this really interesting when he left. The Prime Minister seems to be setting the stage here for possibly him leaving, or he was going to do a wholesale remaking of his cabinet to try to come back, because he only moved Anita Anand added her duties of transport minister, and that's a very important portfolio, by the way, because they've got to make a decision on the high-speed trains that's going to go to cabinet, and they have to do whole things in terms of the air passenger rights. So she's got a lot on her plate, but and he still has not filled the Jeremy Broadhurst campaign director position as well. So I'm almost wondering, like, he's parking it to decide whether he's actually going to go, or if he's going to stay, he's going to come back and do a much wider cabinet shuffle, try to find somebody that can be really aggressive in going after Mr. Poilievre in terms of who he selects as his next campaign director.
Does the Mark Carney arrival as an advisor to PMO and the PM, not leaving his day job, by the way, indicate that maybe that's another sign of change coming?
I mean, that appointment is so rife with problems. I can't even begin. And if the Liberals want to try and shake off, the very old mantle, the days of the sponsorship scandal, the party of not graft, not corruption, that Mark Carney appointment where he still has his day job, being involved with and running some of the top firms in this country while advising the Liberals on fiscal policy, the optics of that are so terrible that I find it difficult to believe there's political calculus there in some way. It's almost just like keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And that's enough for Mr. Carney, because otherwise, the narrative just writes itself for the opposition. Should they come, should he decide to run for leadership, it just doesn't look very good at all.
Well, what about Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister? I mean, she's just been kicked in the teeth. She's supposed to be the finance minister, but hey, really, just go in the corner. I don't want to pay any attention to you because Mark Carney's my guy now. He's the guy who's going to give me my advice. I think what we're probably going to see in the next little while are more cabinet ministers leaving and more MPs saying that they're going to go because they're looking at defeat as long as Justin Trudeau hangs around.
Let's talk about something that we hear about, but people at home don't necessarily. The exodus of Liberal staff off of Parliament Hill. We saw this with the Harper government in its final days too. A lot of, you mentioned Jeremy Broadhurst, but a lot of staffers who people never hear their names of, but they are the people who are running the minister's offices, briefing them, are leaving. They're going to graduate school, they're going into other jobs. There's jokes that everybody's inbox is filling up around Parliament Hill as these folks look for jobs. Is that an indicator, Steph, of the state this government's in?
Oh, 100%. I mean, but also I think it's fair to say that the bleed of Liberal staff now has been happening for, I would say, a couple of years. Like since the 2021 election, a lot of heavy hitters inside ministers' offices, inside the PMO, have fled for greener pastures, seeing the writing on the wall, wanting to get ahead of the legislation that would prevent them from lobbying. There's a clock that starts ticking, right? It's a 5-year ban. You can't engage with government. You want to get ahead of that. Nobody wants to be walking into a flooded job market filled with Liberal staffers when there's a Conservative government in power. So if that's where these things go. So I think it's an indication of a government at the end of its life cycle, whether it's a referendum on the Liberals, whether it's I no longer support the Liberals. You could argue maybe that's not the case. It's just the end of a life cycle of a government, and the people whose jobs really depend on the whim of the voters do still need a paycheck, so they go looking.
Meanwhile, everybody's hiring Conservatives. All the lobbying firms, big corporations, all hiring Conservatives because they know the Liberals are on the way out, and they got to deal with the Poilievre government. This is the normal cycle that happens after governments have been in power for a long time. In this case, 9 years, and that's usually the end of life for most governments. And so this is a cycle that we've all seen, and it really comes down to whether Mr. Trudeau is going to quit and give his party an opportunity perhaps to come back against the Poilievre juggernaut, or to at least win more seats than they probably will be able to under Mr. Trudeau.
We'll be keeping a close eye on it, and of course we'll be talking to the two of you about all the rumblings that we hear on Parliament Hill. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.